In the twilight of Europe's imperial age, one woman stood as a symbol of unshakable strength and dignity. Born into royalty, thrust into the heart of a collapsing empire, and cast into exile, Empress Zita of Austria-Hungary lived a life filled with trials, courage, and unwavering faith. Her story is not just a tale of fallen crowns and lost thrones, but of a resilient spirit that weathered the storms of war, loss, and upheaval with grace. Through her devotion to family, her tireless charity, and her enduring hope, Zita left behind a legacy that still speaks to the human heart today. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will take you on a powerful journey through the life of Empress Zita, from the grandeur of imperial courts to the quiet strength of a life in exile. We'll explore how she became a beacon of resilience, how her faith guided her through unimaginable hardships, and why her story still matters in our modern world. So stay with us as we uncover the lasting legacy of a remarkable woman who turned personal tragedy into a life of purpose and inspiration. Zita of Bourbon-Parma was born on May 9, 1892, into a royal household steeped in tradition, Catholic values, and a deep connection to the old European dynasties. She was the 17th child of Robert I, Duke of Parma, and Maria Antonia of Portugal, which placed her firmly within a vast web of aristocratic alliances that had shaped Europe for centuries. Her childhood was a mix of noble privilege and spiritual rigor. She was raised in a multilingual household where French, Italian, German, and Spanish were spoken fluently, reflecting the diverse legacy of the Bourbon-Parma line. Although she enjoyed the benefits of royal status, including access to the best education and a wide-ranging cultural upbringing, Zita was never a passive participant in her role. From an early age, she was known for her intelligence, devotion, and sense of responsibility, traits that would later define her conduct during the tumultuous years as Empress of Austria-Hungary. Zita's early life was marked by a relatively peaceful existence in the waning years of the 19th century, a period when the great European empires still exerted immense influence across the globe. Her family maintained residences in both Austria and Italy, and she was educated in a convent school, where she developed a deep sense of duty and moral purpose. Religion played a significant role in her worldview. Catholicism was not merely a cultural identity; for her it was a guiding principle in how she saw her place in the world. Her sense of faith would become a pillar of strength during the difficult years ahead. She met Archduke Charles of Austria in her teenage years, and the two were married in October 1911. The marriage was not just a romantic union, but also a strategic one, reinforcing the Bourbon-Parma ties to the Habsburg dynasty. Charles, though not initially expected to ascend to the throne, was third in line after Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But fate shifted dramatically with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, an event that triggered the First World War and upended the balance of power in Europe. Suddenly, Charles became the heir apparent, and Zita, as his wife, found herself thrust into a position of enormous political and symbolic importance. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand marked the beginning of the end for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The empire, a patchwork of ethnicities, languages, and nationalities, had long struggled with internal tensions and nationalist movements. It functioned under a delicate dual monarchy system, with Austria and Hungary having equal status but different political structures. Emperor Franz Joseph had ruled since 1848 and was a symbol of continuity, but his conservative policies and failure to address the growing demands for autonomy from various national groups had created a pressure cooker within the empire. Charles and Zita became emperor and empress in November 1916, following the death of Franz Joseph. The war was already into its third brutal year, and the empire was beginning to crumble under the weight of military defeats, economic hardship, and political unrest. From the very beginning, Zita was not content to remain in the background. She took on an active role, advising her husband and participating in state affairs. Their partnership was unusually egalitarian for the time. Charles relied on her judgment and often sought her input on both domestic and foreign policy matters. Zita believed deeply in the moral and spiritual mission of monarchy, which she viewed as a divinely ordained institution meant to serve the people. She saw herself and Charles as stewards of a sacred trust, a perspective that intensified her commitment to restoring peace and order. Both she and Charles were horrified by the carnage of World War I and sought ways to end the conflict. One of the most notable efforts was the secret peace overtures initiated by Charles through Zita's brother, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who was serving in the Belgian army. Known as the Sixtus Affair, these negotiations aimed to broker a separate peace with the Allies, particularly France, in 1917. However, the effort failed when the details were leaked, leading to a political scandal that further weakened Charles's position. The failure of the Sixtus Affair exemplified the larger dilemma facing the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. While Charles and Zita were genuinely committed to reform and peace, they were operating within an imperial structure that was fundamentally outdated and resistant to change. The war had accelerated nationalist sentiments among the empire's various ethnic groups: Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, and others who no longer saw themselves as subjects of a distant emperor, but as distinct nations with the right to self-determination. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, particularly the principle of national self-determination, resonated deeply across the empire and undermined the legitimacy of imperial rule. Economic conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages, inflation, and strikes became commonplace, and morale within the army plummeted. Soldiers, many of whom were from minority ethnic groups, deserted in increasing numbers. Revolutionary fervor, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, began to spread. By 1918, it was clear that the empire could not be sustained. Charles made a last-ditch effort to transform the empire into a federation of autonomous states, hoping that decentralization would placate nationalist demands. But it was too late. The various national councils began declaring independence, and the empire began to disintegrate in real time. In October 1918, as Austria-Hungary faced imminent collapse, Charles issued a manifesto offering autonomy to the empire's constituent nationalities. The manifesto, however, failed to stem the tide of secession. Czechoslovakia declared independence on October 28, followed by the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. Hungary terminated its union with Austria on October 31st. By November, the imperial structure had effectively ceased to exist. On November 11, 1918, the same day that World War I officially ended, Charles issued a proclamation relinquishing his participation in state affairs in Austria. 2 days later, he did the same in Hungary. However, he did not formally abdicate the throne, as he believed he could not renounce what he considered a divine responsibility. This ambiguous stance left him and Zeta in a precarious position. For the new republican governments forming across the former empire, their continued presence was a potential rallying point for monarchists, and thus a threat to stability. Facing growing pressure and no real power, the imperial family was forced into exile. In March 1919, Charles, Zeta, and their children were sent to Switzerland. The transition was abrupt and painful. They had gone from the grandeur of Schönbrunn Palace and the Hofburg to the uncertainty of life in exile, with limited resources and no clear future. Zeta, who had once overseen imperial banquets and advised on matters of state, now found herself managing a modest household, seeking ways to provide for her growing family while maintaining a semblance of dignity. Life in Switzerland was a sharp contrast to their former lives, but it was only the beginning of their wanderings. Zeta gave birth to her 8th child, Archduchess Elizabeth, in 1922 in exile. Despite the challenges, she remained committed to Charles's vision of a restored monarchy. In 1921, Charles made 2 ill-fated attempts to regain the Hungarian throne, believing he could rally monarchist support and re-establish his rule. Both efforts failed, in part due to the opposition of the regent of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, and the reluctance of the Allies to support any return of the Habsburgs. After the second failed restoration attempt, Charles and Zeta were taken into custody and eventually exiled to the Portuguese island of Madeira. The conditions there were harsh, especially compared to their previous homes. The island was remote, damp, and offered little in the way of comfort. It was during this time that Zeta faced one of the greatest personal tragedies of her life. In April 1922, Charles contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 34. Zeta, only 29 at the time, was left a widow with 8 children, the youngest of whom was just a few months old. Her husband's death marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Zeta refused to accept the fall of the monarchy as final. Dressed in black mourning attire, which she would wear for the rest of her life, she dedicated herself to preserving the memory of Charles and to preparing her son, Otto, for a potential future role as emperor. She moved the family from Madeira to Spain, then to Belgium, and eventually to Luxembourg and Canada during World War II. Each move was dictated by political necessity and the search for safety. Throughout these years, Zita remained active in monarchist circles and deeply involved in her children's education. She saw their survival and success as essential to keeping alive the Habsburg legacy. Otto von Habsburg would go on to become a prominent advocate for European unity and a member of the European Parliament, fulfilling in a different form the ideals of transnational unity that both Charles and Zita had espoused. Despite the many losses and hardships, Zita never expressed bitterness. She maintained a deep religious faith and a steadfast belief in her husband's ideals. In later years, she became a respected figure among monarchists and historians, not only as the last Empress of Austria-Hungary, but also as a symbol of resilience, dignity, and moral conviction in the face of overwhelming adversity. She lived to the age of 96, passing away in 1989, just months before the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the beginning of a new chapter in European history. Zita's life was, in many ways, a microcosm of the broader collapse of Europe's imperial order. She was born into a world of grandeur, tradition, and rigid hierarchy, only to witness its unraveling through war, revolution, and exile. Yet even as the empire fell, she held fast to its highest ideals: service, faith, and duty. In doing so, she offered not just a witness to history, but a vision of nobility grounded in responsibility rather than privilege. Her journey from Empress to exile is a testament to the enduring complexity of historical change and how individuals navigate it with courage and grace. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire crumbled in the final days of 1918, Zita of Bourbon-Parma found herself not only the widow of a dying monarchy, but also the mother of a young family suddenly cut off from their country, their palace, their power, and nearly all of their security. As the once vast empire dissolved into smaller nationalist republics and political factions, the imperial family was left in limbo, their status unclear, their safety uncertain, and their future unknown. After her husband, Emperor Charles I, relinquished his participation in state affairs in both Austria and Hungary, refusing to formally abdicate due to his belief in the divine right of kings, Zita and her family were compelled to flee their homeland, leaving behind centuries of tradition and the very identity that had defined them. Switzerland became their initial destination in exile. The choice was not arbitrary. Switzerland's neutrality and long-standing reputation as a haven for displaced royalty and political exiles made it one of the few places that could offer a measure of safety during such turbulent times. But even this arrangement was politically complicated. The newly formed republics of Austria and Hungary were wary of the Habsburgs, fearing that any continued presence might incite monarchist uprisings or counter-revolutionary activity. The Allies, especially France and the United Kingdom, were also cautious. They saw the re-establishment of monarchies in Central Europe as a potential threat to the fragile post-war order. As a result, Switzerland's offer of refuge came with conditions. The Habsburgs could remain, but they were to keep a low profile, refrain from political activity, and accept a life far removed from the courtly grandeur they once knew. Settling in the village of Prangens on the northwestern shore of Lake Geneva, Zita and Charles rented a modest villa. It was far from the opulence of Schönbrunn or the Hofburg Palace, but it was a safe place to regroup. The move marked a dramatic change in lifestyle for everyone. Zita, who had grown up in aristocratic comfort and had become empress in her early 20s, was now expected to manage a household without servants, without state support, and without the trappings of imperial life. Daily routines changed overnight. The burden of managing basic household tasks, overseeing the children's education, and balancing their dwindling financial resources fell largely on Zita's shoulders. Adapting to this simpler life was not easy. Zita had always been active in her role as empress, deeply engaged in politics, diplomacy, and charitable causes. Now she found herself occupied with making ends meet, finding affordable clothes and food, and adjusting her children to their new reality. The practical challenges were exacerbated by emotional and psychological strain. There was grief over the loss of their empire, over the uncertainty of their identity, over the disconnection from their people. There was anxiety about their security, their finances, and the children's future. Yet in all this, Zita never wavered in her resolve. The children, too, had to adjust to a world unlike anything they had ever known. Otto, the eldest, was only 6 years old when the family went into exile. Raised to one-day rule, he now found himself without a throne and without a country. Zita insisted on a rigorous education, not just for Otto, but for all her children. She believed that knowledge, character, and faith would be their armor in an uncertain world. Tutors were found to teach them languages, history, and mathematics. The family continued to speak multiple languages at home, preserving the multicultural traditions of their former empire. But learning now occurred in improvised classrooms, often around kitchen tables or in cramped rooms without heating, rather than in palatial study halls or gilded classrooms. Despite the diminished circumstances, Zeta strove to maintain a sense of dignity and structure. Each day had a routine. Prayers, studies, meals, and walks were part of the rhythm of life, grounding the children in stability even as the world around them remained unstable. Religious devotion was central to Zeta's approach to life. Her Catholic faith, deeply ingrained since childhood, now became both a comfort and a guiding principle. Every decision she made was rooted in this faith, which she saw not only as a private belief but as a public duty. She reminded her children constantly that their identity did not rely solely on power or title, but on service, humility, and spiritual strength. Meanwhile, Charles struggled with the practicalities of being an emperor in name only. He never renounced his title and believed he had a responsibility to return to the throne, particularly in Hungary. In 1921, he attempted two dramatic restoration efforts to reclaim the Hungarian crown. Zeta supported him fully, even helping to coordinate efforts behind the scenes. But both restoration attempts failed. The political climate in Hungary had changed dramatically, and although there were monarchist sympathizers, the ruling regent Miklos Horthy refused to step aside. The failure of these attempts placed the family in greater danger, and as a result, they were forced to leave Switzerland and were eventually exiled even further to the remote island of Madeira. But before that chapter, Switzerland remained a place of temporary refuge where Zeta began to forge the identity that would sustain her through decades of hardship. Even in exile, she acted with the resolve and grace of an empress. She dealt with the Swiss authorities diplomatically, maintaining a delicate balance between obeying the restrictions placed on her family and advocating for their dignity and future. She refused to accept the notion that her family was defeated. The monarchy had fallen, but the ideals it represented, order, unity, faith, remained alive in her mind and heart. Her determination to raise her children in this tradition became her mission. The family's financial situation was precarious. Most of their properties had been confiscated by the new republics. Without income, they relied on donations from sympathetic royal families and Habsburg loyalists scattered across Europe. Zeta was often forced to manage funds with careful precision, selling jewelry or other heirlooms when necessary to cover basic expenses. At the same time, she shielded the children from the full extent of these hardships, preserving a sense of normalcy and pride. In public, she maintained the posture of a royal consort. In private, she took on the burdens of a single mother managing a household in exile. She never allowed bitterness or self-pity to take root. Zeta accepted hardship with quiet strength, drawing upon a deep well of faith that had been nurtured since her childhood. She saw suffering as a test, not a punishment. Her prayers were constant, and her sense of duty to her late husband, to her children, to the legacy of the Habsburgs remained unshaken. Her spiritual outlook transformed their exile from a fall into disgrace into a journey through sacrifice, with the possibility of redemption and renewal. Every setback, every insult, every indignity was met with a kind of spiritual resilience that astonished many who knew her. Within their small household, she cultivated a powerful sense of community and discipline. Meals were eaten together. Lessons were discussed afterward. The family read scripture aloud. Hymns were sung in the evenings. The children were taught not to look back with longing, but forward with hope. They were not to see themselves as victims, but as caretakers of a noble tradition temporarily in exile. This upbringing profoundly shaped the worldview of Otto and his siblings. Otto, in particular, would emerge from this environment with a strong sense of duty, political engagement, and a belief in European cooperation. These ideas had been instilled not in the halls of power, but in the quiet corners of Swiss exile, under Zeta's steadfast guidance. Zeta's exile in Switzerland was more than just a pause between greater movements. It was a transformative chapter that revealed the core of her character. Stripped of titles, palaces, and official power, she stood revealed as a woman of immense inner strength. The political complexities that brought her there only highlighted the clarity of her own convictions. While the world debated the legitimacy of monarchy and redrew borders on maps, Zeta focused on what she could control, raising her children with honor, maintaining her faith, and preserving the ideals she believed in. She never participated in the politics of revenge. She never sought to exploit sympathy. Her actions were guided by principle, not opportunism. Those early years in Switzerland would leave an indelible mark on her family. They would learn resilience not through easy comforts, but through enduring loss and making do. They would learn leadership not through power, but through example. And they would learn the true meaning of loyalty not to a flag or a throne, but to a set of enduring values. Even after they left Switzerland for Madeira, and later for various other places during their continued exile, the lessons forged in those years remained with them. Zita's life in Switzerland was a testament to quiet endurance in the face of profound loss. It demonstrated that dignity could exist without wealth, that leadership could persist without a crown, and that love for one's family could be the most powerful form of resistance to despair. She would go on to face even greater trials: the death of her husband, more years of exile, and the upheaval of a Second World War. But the foundation laid in those first years in Prangens gave her the tools to withstand all of it. In her strength, her children found hope. In her faith, they found purpose. And in her example, the memory of a fallen empire was transformed from a relic of the past into a living legacy of perseverance and grace. Zita of Bourbon-Parma lived a life shaped by tradition, upheaval, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. Born into European nobility and thrust into imperial responsibility as Empress of Austria-Hungary, she would later spend the majority of her life in exile, navigating political storms, personal losses, and the challenges of raising a family far from the grandeur of court life. Throughout this journey, Zita's Catholic faith was the constant that shaped every aspect of her identity: her marriage, motherhood, charity work, and the resilient example she provided to her children and the world. Raised in a deeply devout Catholic household, Zita's spiritual formation began in childhood and only deepened as she grew. Her education was conducted partly in convent schools, where she developed both a disciplined intellect and a strong interior life of prayer and reflection. Her worldview was thoroughly infused with the conviction that life was a pilgrimage shaped by divine will. Religion was not simply ritual or culture. It was the lens through which she understood her duties, her suffering, and her mission. When she married Archduke Charles of Austria in 1911, their shared Catholic faith formed a foundation not just for their personal life, but also for their joint sense of imperial duty. As Empress, Zita brought to court an unusual blend of political acumen and spiritual conviction. She was no mere consort. She engaged actively in state matters, often offering counsel to Charles and supporting his efforts to negotiate peace during World War I. But even amid the political demands of her station, Zita never ceased to prioritize her religious life. The couple attended daily Mass, prayed together, and raised their children in a home centered on Catholic teaching. Their piety was not performative. It was a lived and consistent presence in their private and public lives. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the family's flight into exile marked a radical change. Stripped of her crown, displaced from her homeland, and increasingly isolated from the centers of power, Zita could have given in to despair or bitterness. Instead, her faith became more pronounced. Where power had once defined her identity, now sacrifice and trust in God did. Her role as mother became paramount, not only in ensuring her children's survival, but in instilling in them the moral and spiritual tools to carry the values of their family legacy forward, even without a throne. Raising 8 children in exile was no small task. She had been widowed at the age of 29 when Charles died in 1922 on the island of Madeira. In the decades that followed, Zita became both father and mother to her children, and her parenting was shaped by equal parts discipline, love, and religious conviction. She took it upon herself to supervise their education, ensuring that they were taught history, languages, mathematics, and the arts. But above all, she made sure they were formed in the Catholic faith. Morning and evening prayers were non-negotiable. The rosary was a daily practice. The sacraments were at the center of their lives. Zita didn't just teach religious doctrine, she modeled it. Her children watched her endure suffering with grace, work tirelessly despite limited resources, and respond to hostility with forgiveness. In each act of daily sacrifice, choosing not to complain about financial hardship, caring personally for the ill, maintaining family routines with order and calm, Zita demonstrated the power of faith in action. She emphasized the dignity of every human being, the redemptive power of suffering, and the necessity of trust in God's providence, even when no earthly comforts remained. Even while managing her large family under difficult conditions, Zita devoted herself to helping others in need. Exile did not strip her of her commitment to charity, it amplified it. She established and supported numerous charitable initiatives, often focusing on the most vulnerable: refugees, the poor, and children displaced by war. In each country, she lived in Switzerland, Spain, Belgium, the United States, and later Canada. Zita quietly, but actively participated in charitable works, coordinating aid, leveraging her connections to gather support, and volunteering time and resources wherever she could. Her work was often behind the scenes, unnoticed by the public, yet deeply impactful to those who benefited from it. During World War II, as Europe once again descended into chaos, Zita and her family were forced to move repeatedly to escape danger. They settled for a time in Quebec, Canada, where the family lived in modest accommodations. Here again, Zita remained true to her mission. She encouraged her children to participate in community life, promoted local charitable efforts, and supported the church's work in caring for the displaced and suffering. Her presence among the Canadian faithful, quiet, dignified, and compassionate, left a lasting impression on those who encountered her. As the years passed, Zita became more than a symbol of a bygone monarchy. She came to represent something far deeper: the capacity of the human spirit to endure with grace, anchored in something greater than worldly status. She never sought to regain her former title through politics or rebellion. Her sense of legitimacy and purpose came not from public recognition, but from her role as a mother, a Catholic, and a servant of others. In private conversations with family and friends, she spoke not of resentment over her losses, but of gratitude for the opportunities she had to serve God in new ways. Her eldest son, Otto von Habsburg, carried this legacy into his own public life. A committed Catholic and advocate for European unity, Otto became a prominent political figure in post-war Europe, serving as a member of the European Parliament and advocating for the reunification of the continent on Christian democratic principles. His worldview, shaped in the crucible of exile and formed under Zita's guidance, reflected the same values of service, faith, and responsibility that his mother had imparted to him. The other children also carried forward her legacy in various ways, with many entering religious life or pursuing vocations of quiet service and scholarship. Zita's life continued into the late 20th century. She witnessed the rise and fall of fascism, communism, and the eventual collapse of the Iron Curtain. These historical shifts underscored the impermanence of worldly power and the enduring relevance of the values she had lived by. Even in her final years, Zita remained intellectually sharp and spiritually vibrant. Visitors would find her praying, reading scripture, and encouraging others in their faith. Her humble residence contained few reminders of her former status: no crown, no throne, no displays of privilege, but it radiated a peace and dignity that came from a life well lived in fidelity to God. When she died in 1989 at the age of 96, the world paid tribute to a woman who had lived through almost a century of upheaval, yet never wavered in her devotion to faith, family, and service. Her funeral, held in Vienna, was attended by thousands who recognized in her not just a former empress, but a figure of moral strength and Christian witness. In 2009, the Catholic Church formally opened her cause for beatification, acknowledging her heroic virtues and the deep spiritual impact of her life. The process is ongoing, but already her life serves as an unofficial source of inspiration for many who look to her story as one of integrity, courage, and unwavering hope. The lessons Zita conveyed are timeless. She showed that true nobility is not rooted in wealth or status, but in how one responds to loss and adversity. She reminded the world that motherhood is a vocation of immense influence, especially when guided by faith and love. She demonstrated that resilience is not simply the ability to survive, but the grace to continue giving, believing, and loving even when everything seems lost. And above all, she exemplified the power of religious conviction to transform personal suffering into a source of strength, not only for oneself, but for generations to come. Her story remains relevant today, not because of her imperial title, but because of how she chose to live after losing it. Zita's faith was not sentimental or passive. It was the backbone of her endurance. Her motherhood was not confined to providing food or discipline. It was the vehicle through which she shaped the conscience of a future generation. And her charity was not for show. It was a deeply personal commitment to the dignity of every human life. Through her quiet, persistent witness, Zita of Bourbon-Parma showed that holiness is not reserved for those who live in convents or perform miracles, but is attainable by anyone who chooses to live every moment with faith, humility, and love. Even decades after her death, Zita's life continues to speak. Her children, grandchildren, and admirers carry forward her example in different ways, through public service, religious life, or private acts of kindness. Her letters, writings, and the memories of those who knew her preserve the wisdom she imparted through words and actions alike. In a world often obsessed with power, recognition, and material success, Zita's life offers a quiet but powerful counterpoint. A legacy built not on what she gained, but on what she gave, and not on what she achieved, but on how faithfully she endured. The woman who once stood at the pinnacle of imperial splendor and later walked through the shadows of war and exile left behind more than a historical footprint. She left a map for navigating suffering with dignity, parenting with purpose, and living with faith in a world that is often unstable and unjust. For those who feel forgotten, displaced, or burdened by loss, her life is a testimony that even in exile, even in obscurity, one can live with meaning, love with courage, and believe without end. Zita's enduring legacy is not just one of monarchy, but of sanctity, a life that bore witness to the hope and strength that faith can bring in every circumstance. Zita of Bourbon-Parma's life spanned the most tumultuous years in European history, from the twilight of empires to the rise and fall of totalitarian regimes and the eventual reconfiguration of Europe in the post-war period. Yet within that vast sweep of historical change, her most enduring contribution was profoundly personal: the raising of her children. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the untimely death of her husband, Charles I, Zita's world narrowed from imperial court to modest exile. It was within this more intimate world, however, that her influence deepened. She became a mother not only to her 8 children but also, in a sense, to a legacy guiding the scattered remnants of a once great dynasty through war, displacement, and reinvention. Each of her children would take a different path, molded by Zita's values, shaped by the unique pressures of exile, and animated by the dignity and purpose she instilled in them. Zita's children were raised amid constant uncertainty, frequent relocations, limited financial resources, and the political stigma of being heirs to a deposed monarchy. Yet they grew up with a strong sense of identity, a deep faith, and a rigorous education. From the very beginning, Zita made it her mission to equip them for a world that no longer honored their titles, but still demanded their integrity. This foundation enabled each of them to follow a unique journey, from political activism to religious life, academic excellence to artistic expression. Zita did not attempt to control their destinies. Instead, she nurtured their strengths and gave them a shared understanding of duty, honor, and service that guided. Otto von Habsburg, her eldest son, was born to be emperor. Groomed from birth for leadership, he was a child when the empire fell and a teenager when his father died. In the years that followed, Zita became his chief teacher, counselor, and supporter. She ensured that he received a classical education steeped in history, languages, and political thought. She prepared him not just to lead, but to serve without bitterness or nostalgia, but with clarity and purpose. Otto did not retreat into the past. Instead, he became a visionary advocate for European unity, dedicating his life to building bridges between nations rather than restoring a fallen throne. As a member of the European Parliament and later a senior voice in the Christian democratic movement, Otto argued passionately for a united Europe rooted in shared values, democracy, and human rights. His vision reflected the best ideals of the old empire: multi-ethnic cooperation, religious tolerance, and civic responsibility reimagined for a modern world. Zita's influence was unmistakable in his humility, his moral clarity, and his tireless pursuit of public service. While Otto became the most public face of the family, Zita's other children also followed noteworthy and deeply meaningful paths. Robert, the second son, pursued a career in finance and diplomacy, serving as the Habsburg representative in many charitable and cultural organizations. He lived a quieter life, deeply loyal to his mother and siblings, and worked behind the scenes to preserve the family's heritage. Felix and Karl Ludwig, 2 of the younger sons, also maintained ties to the Habsburg legacy while seeking their own identities in exile. Felix moved to Mexico and later the United States, where he lived a private life and engaged in business. Karl Ludwig, similarly, found his vocation outside the glare of politics, choosing instead to live with dignity and modesty, reflecting the values Zita had taught him. The daughters of Zeta embraced equally diverse and meaningful roles. Adelheid, the eldest daughter, was a gifted scholar who earned a doctorate in political science from the University of Louvain. In an era when women were often discouraged from advanced education, especially in conservative royal circles, Zeta supported her daughter's ambitions without hesitation. She saw intelligence and academic achievement as a form of service and opportunity to contribute meaningfully to society and bear witness to truth. Adelheid remained close to her mother throughout her life and never married, devoting much of her time to family and academic pursuits. Charlotte, another daughter, chose the religious life, becoming a Benedictine nun under the name Mother Maria Regina. Her decision was deeply shaped by the spiritual intensity of her upbringing, and Zeta's joy in this vocation was profound. For Zeta, her daughter's calling was a testament to the spiritual fruit of their family's suffering and perseverance. Zeta's children, in their varied lives, demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, contribute, and maintain dignity in exile. Though each of them carried the weight of their imperial heritage, none of them allowed it to define them in isolation. Instead, they internalized the values their mother had modeled: faith, service, discipline, and courage. Zeta had transformed the trauma of exile into a training ground for character. She never minimized the suffering they had endured. She knew all too well the impact of loss, the burden of political isolation, and the daily indignities of displacement. But she refused to let these experiences become a source of bitterness. She taught her children to find meaning in their trials and to draw strength from their history without being enslaved to it. Over the years, Zeta's role evolved from that of empress and wife to matriarch and moral compass. She guided her family with quiet authority, often behind the scenes but always with clarity. Her letters to her children were filled with advice, encouragement, and theological reflection. She remained the center of the family's emotional and spiritual life, ensuring that they gathered whenever possible, remained connected to one another, and remembered the sacrifices that had brought them to where they were. Even as her children grew into independent adults with lives of their own, Zeta continued to embody the unity and continuity of the Habsburg legacy. Her belief in the enduring significance of the Habsburg family was not rooted in nostalgia or political ambition. Rather, it stemmed from a profound conviction that the values the dynasty had upheld: multicultural integration, Christian ethics in public life, and the duty of rulers to serve the common good still had relevance in a fractured world. She saw the history of her family not as a relic of aristocratic privilege, but as a repository of lessons for the future. In this sense, preserving the family's legacy was not about restoring a throne, but about maintaining a witness to a certain moral and civic tradition. Zeta worked quietly but diligently to safeguard family archives, promote historical scholarship, and support cultural institutions that preserve the memory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not to celebrate lost glory, but to ensure that its moral and political lessons were not forgotten. Zeta also supported the publication of biographies, memoirs, and historical studies that offered a more nuanced view of her husband's reign and their family's experience during and after World War I. She remained deeply involved in the cause for Charles's canonization, believing that his personal holiness, commitment to peace, and suffering in exile deserved recognition. To her, this was not just an act of personal loyalty, but a reaffirmation of the idea that leadership must be moral, sacrificial, and accountable to God. Her commitment to this cause was as much a spiritual mission as a historical one, and it represented her lifelong belief that human dignity transcends worldly power. Zeta's later years were marked by both physical decline and increasing spiritual depth. Living in relative obscurity in Switzerland and later in Germany, she remained active in prayer, correspondence, and family matters until the very end. She welcomed visitors with warmth and humility, often asking more about their lives than talking about her own. Those who met her in her old age were often struck not by the grandeur of her past, but by the serenity and wisdom she exuded. She spoke little of her losses, choosing instead to reflect on faith, the enduring presence of God in human history, and the importance of staying true to one. Her death in 1989 marked the end of an era, with her past one of the last living links to the old European empires. Yet her influence continued in the lives of her children, grandchildren, and all those who had been touched by her example. Zeta's journey from royal palace to modest exile, from imperial ceremonies to quiet family dinners, from the heights of power to the depths of loss, was ultimately a journey of sanctification. She never allowed herself to be defined by what the world had taken from her. Instead, she became the steady hand guiding her family through one of the most turbulent centuries in European history. Her legacy remains not in buildings or monuments, but in the lives she shaped. Her children's paths, diverse, courageous, and morally grounded, are a testament to the quiet power of her leadership. Through them, and through the enduring values she taught and lived, the spirit of the Habsburg family continued into a new era, not as rulers of an empire, but as servants of a vision. In many ways, Zita achieved what few monarchs ever do. She passed on not just a name, but a soul, a vision of life rooted in faith, shaped by service and sustained by hope. Today, Zita is remembered as a figure of dignity, resilience, and profound maternal strength. She turned exile into a mission, motherhood into leadership, and suffering into sanctity. Her belief in the Habsburg legacy was never about power for its own sake. It was about responsibility, memory, and witness. She believed that even in defeat, there is honor. Even in obscurity, there is purpose. And even in silence, there is a voice that can teach and inspire. Her family's journey, marked by adaptation, perseverance, and faith, is a reflection of the inner strength she nurtured in them. Long after the crowns were gone and the palaces silent, the true legacy of Zita lived on in the hearts and minds of those she guided, those she served, and those who now remember her not as an empress in exile, but as a mother of enduring hope. Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma remains one of the most quietly enduring figures of 20th century European history. Her life, framed by royal birth, imperial marriage, catastrophic upheaval, and decades of exile, offers a window into the collapse of an age, the reshaping of Europe, and the triumph of human dignity in the face of deep loss. Zita was not merely the last empress of Austria-Hungary. She was a woman whose inner strength, unwavering faith, and deep devotion to family turned personal tragedy into a mission of perseverance and moral witness. Her legacy cannot be measured in political terms or confined to the historical dates of wars and treaties. Rather, it lives on through the example she set, the values she preserved, and the quiet influence she exerted across generations. In Zita's journey, one finds not only the closing chapter of a vanished empire, but also a portrait of resilience, character, and meaning in the face of overwhelming adversity. From her earliest days, Zita was immersed in a world of tradition and expectation. Born into the Bourbon-Parma family, she understood both the privileges and burdens of royal life. She was educated in a multilingual and multinational environment, trained in discipline, religious devotion, and a clear sense of duty. When she married Archduke Charles, the future Emperor Charles I of Austria, she embraced not just a role but a cause: the maintenance of an empire that was already beginning to fray under the pressures of nationalism, war, and political change. Zita's marriage to Charles was a true partnership, grounded not only in affection but in shared ideals and a common understanding of their roles as custodians of a vast and fragile realm. When Charles became emperor during the turmoil of World War I, Zita was at his side not merely as consort, but as confidant, advisor, and moral support. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of the defining events of the early 20th century. For Zita, it meant the shattering of a world she had helped to uphold, a world of inherited responsibility, cultural plurality, and dynastic continuity. The abdication of her husband and their subsequent exile marked a definitive rupture with the past. Yet it was in this dislocation that Zita's true legacy began to take shape. Deprived of power, she found strength in faith. Deprived of home, she found meaning in motherhood. Deprived of certainty, she found purpose in endurance. The young empress, who once presided over court ceremonies and political rituals, became a widow, refugee, and mother of 8 children, all while navigating a world increasingly hostile to the ideals she embodied. What makes Zita's legacy so lasting is not only what she suffered, but how she responded. She never gave in to bitterness or despair. Instead, she redoubled her commitment to her family, her faith, and the belief that even amid failure, one could live with honor. Her life in exile was marked by hardship, instability, and financial insecurity. She moved from country to country: Switzerland, Spain, Belgium, France, the United States, and Canada, often fleeing the tides of war or political tension. Through all these years, Zita remained a pillar of strength for her children, ensuring that they received a thorough education, that they learned to live with dignity, and that they understood their heritage not as a privilege to exploit, but as a duty to carry. In this way, Zita's life became a parable of the modern European experience. She witnessed and lived through the death of empires, the devastation of world wars, the rise of fascism and communism, and the reconfiguration of national identities. But unlike many political figures of the age, she did not retreat into nostalgia or fantasy. She understood that the world had changed irrevocably and that the ideals she cherished, Christian faith, civic duty, compassion for the poor, and unity among nations, had to find new expressions in the changed landscape. Her legacy, therefore, is not about longing for a lost throne, but about exemplifying how to live meaningfully when the structures that once gave life shape and security have collapsed. Zita's moral courage was particularly evident in her approach to faith. A devout Roman Catholic, she saw her trials not as misfortunes to be resented, but as a share in the suffering of Christ. This perspective gave her the inner strength to endure widowhood, exile, and financial hardship without losing her spiritual footing. Her faith was not sentimental but deeply rooted in daily practice: prayer, sacraments, spiritual reading, and acts of charity. Even as she managed the practicalities of raising a large family under difficult conditions, she maintained a spiritual discipline that became the bedrock of her inner life. Her children were taught not just catechism, but a living faith that could withstand adversity. Through her example, they learned that faith was not something reserved for peaceful times, but was most needed when life was at its most unpredictable. Zita also devoted herself to charitable work, even when her own resources were meager. She saw the suffering of others, refugees, war victims, the poor, not as abstract problems, but as personal calls to action. Throughout her years in exile, she supported relief efforts, organized aid, and offered assistance wherever she could. She believed that one's own suffering could be redeemed by helping others, and that the Christian life required a constant attention to those in need. This commitment to charity was not political, but deeply personal, a continuation of the duties she had assumed as Empress, transformed to fit her new circumstances. Her efforts helped countless individuals and communities, and her concern for the marginalized added yet another layer to her legacy. The legacy of Zeta is also deeply entwined with the broader historical narrative of Europe in the 20th century. As a living witness to the fall of one of Europe's greatest dynasties, she offers a human face to the abstract processes of political change. Her story provides insight into what happens when entire ways of life are uprooted, when identities shaped by centuries are suddenly called into question, and when individuals must find new foundations on which to build their lives. For historians, Zeta represents not just the end of an era, but the possibility of continuity through personal virtue. Her capacity to adapt without surrendering her values, to change without losing her integrity, makes her a unique figure in modern history. Moreover, Zeta's life speaks to enduring human themes: family, loss, duty, resilience that transcend time and geography. In a world often dominated by fleeting trends and ephemeral achievements, her quiet persistence stands as a reminder that greatness is not always measured in visible accomplishments. Sometimes, it is found in the daily fidelity to one's responsibilities, the strength to bear suffering with grace, and the humility to accept one's place in history without resentment. Zeta's story encourages us to think differently about legacy, not as a record of public victories, but as the sum of one's private choices, the people one shapes, and the values one passes on. Her relevance today is profound. In a time of widespread uncertainty, social fragmentation, and ideological polarization, the values Zeta lived by faith, family, perseverance, and service offer a blueprint for navigating complexity. Her life challenges the prevailing emphasis on self-assertion and individual success, offering instead a model of quiet leadership, rootedness, and sacrifice. In Zeta, we see someone who never allowed external events to dictate the meaning of her life. She showed that even when stripped of title, home, and security, one can live with courage and contribute meaningfully to the world. Perhaps the most touching element of Zeta's legacy is the impact she had on her children and grandchildren. She raised them not to mourn a lost empire, but to serve the world as it is. Otto, her eldest son, became a voice for democratic Europe. Others contributed to the worlds of education, religion, culture, and diplomacy. Their achievements were not acts of dynastic ambition, but expressions of a moral upbringing that emphasized responsibility over entitlement. Zeta's influence extended beyond her immediate family, inspiring those who met her, read about her, or encountered her story. She became, in her later years, a quiet symbol of dignity, a living reminder that history is not only made by revolutions and wars, but also by the fidelity of a mother, the endurance of a widow, and the prayers of a believer. As she neared the end of her life, Zita remained engaged in the world around her, though never seeking the spotlight. She corresponded with family, friends, and spiritual advisors. She participated in religious ceremonies and supported the beatification because of her husband Charles, not out of vanity, but from a deep belief in his sanctity and the need to hold up his witness for peace and justice. Even in death, Zita wished to make a statement of humility and continuity. Her burial in the imperial crypt of the Capuchin Church in Vienna, attended by thousands, including heads of state, scholars, clergy, and ordinary citizens, was not just a ceremonial farewell, it was a recognition of a life lived with honor, even in obscurity. The resonance of Zita's legacy continues to grow. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in her life, not just among historians and monarchists, but among people searching for models of character and meaning. Her cause for beatification, officially opened by the Church, reflects the spiritual impact she had on many who saw in her a life of heroic virtue. Her writings, letters, and testimonies from those who knew her paint a portrait of a woman of immense inner strength, who never ceased to believe in the possibility of good emerging from suffering. This message has lost none of its power. In an age that often seems disoriented by rapid change and spiritual confusion, Zita's calm perseverance and moral clarity shine with renewed relevance. Zita's story is not just the tale of an empress or a widow or even a mother. It is the story of a soul who, through every trial, remained faithful to her calling. Her legacy is not housed in palaces or preserved in marble, but written in the hearts of those she loved, taught, and inspired. In her example, we find hope not in the restoration of old forms, but in the enduring possibility of a life well lived, even in exile, even in silence, even in defeat. Empress Zita reminds us that no loss is final when it is met with faith, no exile is absolute when there is love, and no history is forgotten when its lessons are lived with grace. She stands, even now, as a beacon for those navigating the uncertainties of modern life. Her message is simple but profound, that through faith, family, and a quiet strength of character, we can find meaning amid the storms, dignity amid decline, and hope where the world sees only endings. In remembering Zita, we not only honor the past, but we also find guidance for the future. Her life, shaped by sorrow and sustained by love, offers a timeless answer to the human quest for purpose and peace.